Hey everybody, I'm Kevin Ketchum, aka the Nerdy Jock. DK couldn't be with us here this week, but he'll hopefully be back next week for you guys, okay? So let's just jump right in. Today we're talking about episode 4 of the new Ghost in the Shell anime. And I have to say that this episode kind of caught me off guard a little bit. Not because I didn't know what Robot Rondo was, because I did, but because once you start thinking about where this story fits in the larger history of Ghost in the Shell, you kind of realize this episode is doing something really interesting, It's taken us back to the original manga, right? Of course, because it's a direct adaptation. But it's also given us another look at the ideas that would eventually become incredibly important to Ghost in the Shell 2 Innocence. Now, as someone who loves Ghost in the Shell Innocence, that's the stuff you kind of want to talk about after watching this episode. But before we get into all that, let's talk about what actually happens here, okay? So, why are the robots killing people? That's the basic setup for this episode. It's pretty straightforward, right? We've got robots that are deranged. They turn feral in a way, almost like zombies. Kind of cool, kind of creepy. And we've got, violence as usual, which is awesome. Love that in my anime sometimes. And robots get violent, we call Section 9, right? Because apparently in the future, even the robots have decided to make everyone's lives more complicated. So the Major and the team begin investigating what's actually happening, and what starts as a straightforward question, why are these robots malfunctioning? It slowly devolves into something much, much more disturbing, for real. This one's a little darker, guys, because the deeper Section 9 digs into this mystery, the more complicated the relationship becomes between robots and human consciousness, And that's where this episode really gets interesting, because we're no longer talking about robots that are simply malfunctioning. We're talking about artificial bodies, We're talking about consciousness. We're talking about human beings being used in ways that are completely unethically effed up, really messed up. And basically what we're talking about is the concept of ghost dubbing. A human consciousness is put into a completely cybernetic android body. And it's like, you have questions of free will. Can you even separate the mind from the body? These are just all the bigger questions from this episode. So basically, this episode takes the idea that Ghost in the Shell has been pretty much playing with since the very beginning, Can you separate the mind from the body? Can you place a mind into a fake body? What happens when the body is completely artificial? What happens when you try to put a consciousness inside an artificial body? And then what happens when people controlling the technology don't care about the difference in what's happening to these consciousnesses? And that's when Robot Rondo stops being a story about killer robots and starts kind of becoming a story about people. Now, I said I was going to do my 5 biggest takeaways, and here's takeaway number 1. Now, the robots aren't the real villains in this episode. Pretty much like every episode, the robots aren't ever really the villain. It's always who's behind it. I think that's the most important part, is these companies like the Honka Corporation is behind the villainy in this episode too. But you could easily watch this episode and think, okay, killer robots, got it, right? But that's not really what Ghost in the Shell is interested in. And the robots are like the symptoms. The real problem is the system and the government, surrounding them and controlling them. And that's something that I really love about the franchise, is that technology is almost never the real villain. The real villain is usually the humans who decide what they're doing with that technology. Now, we create something, we give it incredible power, we figure out how to exploit it, like everything else, just like AI is doing right now in the real world, which is pretty crazy. The tracks are pretty similar and parallel here right now. Now, when everything goes wrong, it's like, who do you blame? The technology, right? You don't blame the companies, you don't blame the humans, you always blame the technology. It's the same story over and over again. And in Robot Rondo, we're looking at artificial bodies and consciousness. They're being treated like something that can just be manipulated, man. And it's pretty horrifying and terrifying, especially this episode. Why did the robots attack? Who put the consciousness there? Why was it there? Who benefited from this? And suddenly this robot mystery becomes more of a crime story. And that's when I really got hooked. Takeaway number 2. Hello, Ghost in the Shell 2 Innocence. So this chapter is basically the chapter that Oshi used to form the basic concepts and ideas for Ghost in the Shell 2. So that's the biggest takeaway that I think is pretty cool about this episode, because when you look at Ghost in the Shell as a complete series, it's cool to see that you can have Every little bubble is its own biosphere, its own ecosystem. Got your Ghost in the Shell anime right now that was airing on Amazon Prime. You've got your Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. You've got your Ghost in the Shell Arise. You've got your classic films and even the film adaptation. They all have a little bit to do with the Ghost in the Shell universe. And they're all kind of connected too. Based off this manga, they're able to parse off bits and pieces from things that were interesting to them and the creators to make a more complex and involved world. And that's pretty cool. So the fact that it has an Innocence connection is pretty awesome, because come on, you can't watch this episode and not start thinking about that movie, And if you haven't seen Ghost in the Shell 2 Innocence, the basic setup involves Batu and Togusa, similar to this episode, investigating a series of violent incidents involving gynoids, which are artificial women. And in this episode and in the film, they're basically, sex dolls, sex slaves. And what happens is that these machines start to kill their owners. And it does sound pretty familiar, because that's exactly what happens in the film. Now, I'm not saying Robot Rondo and Innocence are the same story, because they're not exactly, but the themes are absolutely the same. The artificial bodies, the human consciousness, the violence, the questions of ownership and exploitation, and of course, the question of whether, something artificial can actually have a ghost. Now, that's the stuff that gets me pretty excited, because up until now in the series, we really haven't touched on that. We've always been touching about, ghost hacking, where human brains with cyborg bodies, kind of like Major or Bato, they can be ghost hacked. But this is a different concept, where it brings in ghost dubbing, where it's a completely android machine and they use a human consciousness and import it into the cyborg machine. It raises a lot of interesting questions about like what's ethical, what's not. And is it basically like slavery, mental slavery, man? It's pretty deep, pretty dark, pretty disturbing, But when you look at the film, that's how Oshii did. He took these ideas and then he created the film Innocence, which is a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, in my opinion. I mean, story-wise, I think I might even like it better than the 1995 original Ghost in the Shell film. But it's a lot more like a David Fincher film. And if Ghost in the Shell, the film to Innocence, was like a David Fincher film, this is definitely more like a Michael Bay or some kind of a lot more lighthearted. I mean, they definitely don't lean into the darkness that this episode really involves, but it's just cool to see how the tone is so different. We had questioned earlier in the pods if the tone was going to start getting darker, and it is a little bit darker in this episode, but it's not dark enough to where like if you're 13, it wouldn't be appropriate for anyone, 13 or over. I would say so. Pretty basic concept there. Takeaway number 3: who owns the body? Now here's where the episode gets really kind of creepy, right? Your body isn't necessarily yours, right? Makoto, before she becomes the head of Section 9, her body is basically owned by the government, because all the cybernetic upgrades, they are paid for by the government. So technically her body is a property of the government when the series first starts out. In this world, obviously you can replace it, you upgrade it, you modify it, you change it. Hell, you can pretty much order a new body and just keep your brainstem in your brain. And that's when it raises like a pretty uncomfortable question, right? Who owns the body, right? Is the body artificial? If the body is artificial, can someone else own it? Is it not yours? What if there's a human consciousness inside of it? What if that consciousness doesn't want to be there? And what happens when corporations and governments get involved and they control you? That's the part that I think makes Ghost in the Shell so timeless. It's like it does ask some really big, deep questions. Underneath all the cyberpunk technology, we're still talking about the very basic human question is like, who owns you? Who controls you? The gynoids are products, they're manufactured, they're sold, and they're designed to satisfy human desire. And yet, if they possess anything resembling consciousness, well, maybe they're more than just a product, Maybe they change. And that's a big problem. And that's a big takeaway. Now, takeaway number 4. Bato was born for this. This is what I'd say the Bato-centric episode, because, Ghost in the Shell 2 Innocence, it famously doesn't even feature the Major until the very end of the film. It's more of a very, it's an in-depth look at someone's psyche and their emotions and how they are. And this episode is kind of similar to that. It starts with Bato's viewpoint. It follows Togusa, And the Major, she's not really a big player in this episode. She just kind of goes around with Aramaki and questions, some high officials in the government like usual today. But, it's just a great reminder that Bato is just an amazing character. I'm a big fan of Bato. And Bato is basically like, we please just shoot some robots, And I'm kidding, but no, I mean, he really does just try to shoot robots. But there's something great about Bato's role in the stories like this is, he's heavily cyberized. He's surrounded by machines, and he's practically more machine than man. And yet somehow, like, he's one of the most emotionally human people in the franchise, especially in the film. You really get to the bottom of that, and you can see a whole different side of Bato. So, that's why Innocence works so well, and that's why this episode works so well as a Bato episode. Takeaway number 5. The real question: who gets a ghost, right? And this is where we get a little bit more, philosophical, I'd say. The basic question of who gets a ghost is underneath the entire episode. We know the Major already has a ghost. We assume Bato has a ghost, which I'd say yes. We know Togusa has a ghost because he's 99% human, besides his cybernetic, imprint chip. But what about the robots? What about artificial intelligence, which really hasn't gotten to be, face forward in this series yet. But it's cool to me because in the first couple episodes, we were talking about ghost hacking into human brains. In this episode, episode 4, it kind of transitions into, now we're looking at artificial beings with human consciousness. And as this series progresses on episode 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, we get into the Puppet Master and actually artificial intelligence. So it's kind of cool because it does slowly make a natural kind of change from like, okay, human brains, cyborg bodies, to cyborg bodies, human brains, to artificial intelligence in cyborg bodies, to what is real, what is reality. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from this episode. That's a really good transitional episode into what is going to make the rest of the season freaking pop. This episode is the framework for the film Ghost in the Shell 2: Innocence. And that's awesome because I think it's a masterpiece. Now, but what this episode does, it reminds us that underneath all the cyber brains, the robots, the hacking, the gunfights, and crazy technology, is that Ghost in the Shell is always asking us the same question. Like, what makes us human? And maybe more importantly, who gets to decide? For me, that's where Robot Rondo really kind of succeeds here. Now, if you love Ghost in the Shell 2: Innocence, I think this episode really gives you a really, really good reason to go back and watch that movie again. We watched it on our podcast. We did a whole episode about it a couple weeks ago. So if you haven't seen that episode yet, I would definitely go back. I'll link it here in this video here and check out our review of Ghost in the Shell 2: Innocence. It's a nice hour and a half long review. I mean, it's in depth, it's detailed, and it just answers all the questions we kind of touch the surface on today in this shorter podcast. But so that's my take on episode 4, Robot Rondo. Now, I want to hear from you guys, right? Did you see the Innocence connection early on? Were you thinking for a few minutes like, hey, what is this? This is very familiar. Or did you not even know or haven't even seen Ghost in the Shell 2: Innocence? I mean, that film is hard to find right now. You have to like order it on Blu-ray. There is like a couple websites. If you go retro anime on YouTube, you can find it to watch in 4K there as well. I think it's legally on YouTube. I'm not even sure, but it's there. But check it out if you haven't seen it there as well. That's what I did. But you got to ask yourself, do you think that the new Ghost in the Shell series is finally giving us the adaptation of the manga we've been waiting for? Or are you guys feeling like you want to see more, I mean, some people I know from the comments, but, I've been talking to people. I know from the comments I've been getting from people that a lot of people love the Oshi version better, and that's okay. These are two completely different animals, same Ghost in the Shell world, but in different ecosystems. Now, let me know what you think about this episode in the comments. We'd love to hear about it. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on your notifications because we got new episodes popping out every other day. We're doing a Dawn to Dawn read-along podcast as well, where we started at chapter 72, and we're going all the way to catch up now. So after where season 2 ends is where we start our manga read-along on 72 of Dawn to Dawn, Dawn to Dawn. That's about it. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you next time on the Ghost in the Shell Watch Along Pod. Os!